It all started back in 1984. It was a lazy, hot summer afternoon. I got a phone call from my cousin who said to me, "Are you sitting down?" She said, "Your dad's in today's New York Times." I didn't get it. He had passed away 10 years earlier and certainly lived a life of anonymity. So I ran down to the newspaper stand and picked up the Times, and there was an article about Alice Neel. And the featured painting in the article was Fuller Brushman. That's my dad. I didn't even know the painting existed. When it was done, I was a little kid. How did this come about? How did my dad become one of Alice Neel's subjects? Well, he was a Fuller Brushman and went door to door selling brushes of every type imaginable on the Upper West Side. And she was one of his customers. She lived at 300 West 107th Street and painted this scene right across the street from her apartment and my dad's stockroom. I went to the gallery the next day to see this incredible portrait of my dad for the first time. There he was, grinning, looking back at me. It was going for $35,000, and my brother and I couldn't afford that kind of money. But I could buy one of her art books, and there he was, prominently on display, an anonymous Fuller Brushman, somebody that had survived Dachau and escaped Nazi Germany. What's the backstory behind Alice Neel and my dad, D. Wall Strauss? What did they have in common? Why did she paint him? What is the intersection between Alice Neel and D. Wall Strauss? Well, Alice had a pretty rough life. She grew up poor, but she had a real passion for her artwork, and she wanted to paint in her own unique style. She lived with others that had a similar background. My dad grew up in the 20s in Germany. He was a middle-class textile salesman, living a pretty good life, practicing his religion freely. In the 30s, things changed dramatically. The Nazis came to power, and there was rampant anti-Semitism in the country. And one night in 1938, in November, there was a knock on the door, and my dad was deported to Dachau. The Nazis used this ledger to induct him into the concentration camp, and there he became prisoner number 20,139. Somebody from the small town of Billigheim, a salesman, single, a Jew, no children, living in Regensburg. He was actually part of a much larger roundup that included both my grandfather, Leopold, and my uncle, David. The one thing I remember my dad telling me about Dachau was that when he finally got home, he had to burn all of his clothing because the lice was that bad. But he was one of the lucky ones. In '39, the Nazis decreed that if a German Jew voluntarily gave up all of their possessions and had a place to go, they could leave the country. And that's where my dad's sister, also named Alice, came into the picture. She wrote this affidavit to the US government promising that she would take care of my dad with her $50 a month in income. So he came over in 1940, and his first job in New York when he landed here was as a busboy at the New York World's Fair. That's my mom and my uncle Carl, her brother, at the fair. Pearl Harbor happened, and he entered the Army. And in fact, he was inducted into the Army in November of '42, only 4 short years after he was inducted into Dachau. He went over to Europe just in time to fight in the Battle of the Bulge. He underwent multiple shrapnel wounds, went into a field hospital, went through some surgeries, and they sent him right back to the front. What's pretty amazing is that his injuries occurred in a small town called Andernach. It was only 250 kilometers from where he was born. The one thing he told me about the war was that he really was afraid of being captured. I mean, you can imagine a German Jew in an American uniform fighting the Nazis back in Germany. We still have his Purple Heart at home. He had an honorable discharge in 1946 and came back to New York, and he decided to do what he did best, and that was sell. So he became a fuller brush dealer. He met Alice Neel in 1965. That's when the painting was done. And by 1974, Alice Neel was actually growing in fame. She had her first show right here in the Whitney that year. But my dad passed away in '74 and really never knew of her increasing fame. Life went on. I found out about the painting in 1984. And in 2000, I got another one of those phone calls. My friend called and said, "Your dad's painting is back." Alice Neel was having another show celebrating her centennial that summer. And the Fuller Brush Man was a critical and important part of the show. In fact, it was a huge part of the media campaign. There's my dad alongside Andy Warhol in the New York Times. And there he is in Time Out New York. He's all over the place. But the thing that really blew me away was walking down Fifth Avenue and seeing buses whizzing by with this gigantic poster of my dad greeting me. I remember walking down into the 49th Street subway station and once again being greeted by him as I descended the stairs. Now, that Aunt Alice, had never seen the painting. And I took her to see the painting at that show that summer. And she was so proud of my dad and of that painting. Anybody within earshot, she would turn to them and say, "That's my brother." She was even interviewed in the local German Jewish newspaper about my brother, the Fuller Brush Man. She was really proud of it. One of the things about the show that I noticed was actually many of Alice's subjects were a little bit on the glum and solemn and sad side. But she was known as a collector of souls, and I think really captured the true nature of my dad, somebody that was grinning, bright, knew things could change anytime, so you better live life to the fullest. The other thing we realized was he was still anonymous. Nobody knew who the Fuller Brush Man was. So it turns out that Ann Temkin was the curator of the show, and I wrote this letter to her. I just wanted her to know who the Fuller Brush Man was, what his name was, a little bit more about him beyond the survivor of Dachau. The next stop on the show was at the wonderful Philadelphia Museum of Art. So I decided to take my kids to see Grandpa's painting at Rocky's Museum that winter. And when we walked in the gallery, we were just so happy. For the first time, we saw my dad's name on the label of the painting. I wrote it down on this brochure because this was, pre-smartphones, didn't have a camera, but I wrote it down. And it said, when D. Wall Strauss, a door-to-door salesman for Fuller Brushes, stopped at Neel's New York City apartment, she asked him to pose for a portrait. During the course of the sitting, Neel found that Strauss was a concentration camp survivor who, after his escape, heroically enlisted in the US Army and returned to Europe to fight against the Nazis in the Battle of the Bulge. We were so happy. The Fuller Brush Man finally had a name. My dad, Mr. D. Strauss. Thank you.